Coming up today, Korea's spy agency is to brief the National Assembly's Intelligence Committee on the suicide of an agent, with links to the surveillance scandal engulfing the agency. Senior nuclear negotiators from South Korea and the United States are set to meet for talks on how to handle North Korea following a landmark deal on Iran's nuclear program. Plus, South Korea marks the 62nd anniversary of the signing of the armistice that ended the Korean War. We'll have two special reports coming up. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello, it's noon on Monday, the 27th of July. You're tuned in to our midday newscast here on Arirang TV. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Broome. We begin today with the latest on the hacking scandal that's embroiling Korea's National Intelligence Service and deepening divisions between the two rival parties. Senior officials from the spy agency will brief the National Assembly's Intelligence Committee in a couple of hours on the progress of their probe into the suicide of a spy agency employee. It was the agent's death that raised so many extra questions about the agency's alleged illegal surveillance of South Korean citizens. NIS chief Lee Byung-ho is also expected to report on the restoration results of a file deleted by the agent before he committed suicide. According to multiple government sources, the restored file does not contain any evidence that can prove the NIS wiretapped citizens. If confirmed this afternoon, the ruling Saenuri party will almost certainly demand an apology from the main opposition party for falsely accusing the NIS of illegal surveillance. The opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy is expected to call for a further probe in the process of restoring the file. Korea is preparing to finally declare itself free of the MERS virus, more than 2 months after the country reported its first case on May 20th. Officials say the isolation order on the last remaining person under quarantine was lifted as of midnight, meaning there are now no people on watch for possible infection. The Central MERS Task Force convened a meeting this morning where it told the government that MERS poses no threat to Korea anymore. The government plans to declare the virtual end of the outbreak when it holds a meeting on Tuesday, presided over by the Prime Minister. No new infections have been reported now in more than 3 weeks. Out of the final 12 MERS patients still recovering in hospital, 11 have tested negative for the virus in 2 rounds of genetic testing. 1 patient has shown mixed results, so further tests will be held this week. The United States special envoy to the six-party talks is in Seoul for talks with his South Korean counterpart on North Korea nuclear issues. South Korea is the first leg of Sydney Seiler's 3-nation trip that also takes him to China and Japan. Seiler will be holding talks with his counterpart Kim Gun and other officials to discuss ways to deal with Pyongyang's nuclear provocations in lieu of Iran's recently inked a nuclear deal with the US and other world powers. Seiler's trip comes hot on the heels of Seoul's top nuclear envoy Hwang Jung-guk's meeting with Chinese officials in Beijing last week, where he asked for China's support in dealing with North Korea. The six-party denuclearization talks involving the two Koreas, the US, China, Japan and Russia, have been stalled since 2008. North Korea appears to have significantly powered down or even completely shut off its main plutonium-producing nuclear reactor for maintenance work. While operations might be sporadic at that part of the Yongbyon facility, 38 North, the US-based website that monitors the North's nuclear activities, says satellite imagery shows construction is continuing at the site's as yet incomplete experimental lightwater reactor. The imagery appears to show the yard is complete, but all the equipment there is probably not yet installed according to their analysis. Now, once finished, North Korea will be another step closer to the initial operation of that reactor. The website also says work is continuing at a rapid pace at the uranium enrichment complex. Now today, July 27th, 2015, marks the 62nd anniversary of the Korean War armistice. The South Korean government has long commemorated the occasion, but since 2013, it has also used the day to honour veterans from the 21 UN member states that supported South Korea during the war. Our Park Ji-won tells us more about the day and its history.
The more than 3 years of bloodshed that began with the communist Northwest invasion of the democratic South on June 25, 1950, officially ended with the signing of the Korean War Armistice Agreement on July 27, 1953. It was one of the longest ceasefire negotiations in history, involving 158 meetings over a span of 2 years and 17 days between the U.S.-led UN Command and the North Korean-Chinese coalition. The first round of negotiations was held in Kaesong in July 1951, but the talks were later moved to Panmunjom, near the present-day border between the two Koreas. By then, the war had already fallen into a bloody stalemate, with a growing number of casualties on both sides after Chinese Communist forces backing the North Koreans conducted a massive offensive against the South Korean army, backed by the US and 15 other UN member states, including the UK and Canada. Agreement on the armistice was finally reached when both sides accepted the terms for a system of voluntary repatriation for prisoners of war, and when South Korean President Lee Seung-man, who was against the armistice, finally accepted it, though only after receiving a promise from the U.S. for a mutual security treaty and a major aid deal for the South. With the signing in July 1953, all military actions were immediately halted, ending the war that had killed and wounded roughly 3 million civilians and soldiers on all sides. The armistice created the demilitarized zone, a 4-kilometer wide buffer zone that is now the de facto border between the two Koreas. It's not much different from the 38th parallel, which divided the two Koreas before the war. But now, 62 years after the signing, the main goal of the Korean Armistice Agreement still has not yet been achieved. The preamble states that the purpose of the agreement is to ensure a complete cessation of hostilities until a final peaceful settlement is achieved. But that final peace treaty has not yet materialized, leaving the important task still to be done. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
So as we just heard, 62 years ago today, the two Koreas signed that armistice treaty ending the 1950 to 1953 Korean War. To mark the occasion, our Hwang Sang-hee sat down with US Congressman Charles Rangel, a Korean War veteran himself, for his views on the war and his hopes for the two Koreas going forward.
So, Congressman, how do you remember the Korean War?
I try not to remember the Korean War. I was 60 years ago, 65 years ago, and it was a nightmare, a nightmare. I try not ever to think about the tens of thousands of Koreans, Americans, and people from over 20 countries being killed. But if you talk about stopping communism and the Republic of Korea blossoming to become an anchor of democracy in that area, then I wish the war wasn't necessary. But there's no question that God has been good to Korea in the recovery.
You've been honored as a war hero. How has your participation in the Korean War changed you?
Having the type of casualties that we had, you wonder, why did we survive with all of the wounded and the deaths that took place? So there's a sense of guilt, because the heroes are the people that gave their lives. Their families have changed, and they're not here to see the results of that war. I can never think of a more gracious people than the South Koreans, because wherever I go, there's flowers, there's medals, there's recognition, and I really accept it for those who lost their lives.
As a man who fought in the Korean War, how do you assess the current situation of the divided Koreas?
how that imaginary line, that 38th parallel, can divide cultures and people with the same blood. I didn't volunteer to say, take me to Korea, I want to get involved in a war. But I did get involved. And I have an investment in Korea, not by choice. And I have an opportunity, not as just a guy on the street saying what a sad story, but a senior man in the Congress and being able to say to the North Koreans, what's more important than bringing your Korean people together?
You are one of the longest serving House member in the U.S. Congress. What would you like to see the most happen on the Korean Peninsula before your term as a U.S. Congressman comes to an end?
I hope that one day, no matter how strong a communist is, that they think about their children, their grandchildren, the value of peace over warfare. And I hope that that happens while I'm in Congress, and I'll be working through those goals if I'm not in Congress. I can't make a major change, but I can be a part of that, working toward that goal, and I enjoy doing it.
Thank you, Congressman, for your time today.
Kamsahamnida, it's been a pleasure being with you.
Now, Korea's GDP per capita may drop for the first time in 6 years due to slow economic growth and the weakening local currency. The Seoul-based LG Economic Research Institute forecasts the figure will dip to $27,600 this year. That's down from last year's $28,100. This severely dampens the government's hopes of reaching a per capita GDP of more than $30,000 this year. The latest figure takes into account the 2.6% economic growth projection, the strong dollar against the Korean won, and a slight rise in the price of goods. Experts from other local think tanks also attribute the weakening consumer sentiment to last year's Seoul ferry sinking and the recent MERS outbreak. They say the economy requires structural reforms and the country must find new growth engines within the domestic market. Korea's top conglomerates are ramping up efforts to hire more full-time workers, helping to tackle the issue of growing temporary positions in the nation. According to local conglomerate tracker Chaebol.com, the number of regular workers at 96 listed companies of the nation's 10 largest conglomerates topped 618,000 in the first quarter of the year. That's up nearly 9,000 or 1.4% from the same period last year. Lotte Group saw the biggest jump of around 13% as it switched a majority of temporary workers to full-time positions. However, 4 conglomerates suffering from falling earnings and undergoing restructuring, such as POSCO and Hanwha, cut the number of their regular workers by a combined 3,000. The 700 megahertz spectrum for both commercial wireless and public safety communications is often referred to as the golden band for its versatility and efficiency. And the Korean government has now decided to allocate the range to both telecom companies and broadcasters. Following a cabinet commission meeting on Monday, the government said it will designate 40 megahertz for the telecommunications sector and 30 megahertz for the country's 5 main networks to broadcast. Ultra-high definition television programming and the 20 megahertz frequency brand will be set aside for public use such as disaster and safety communications. Over the past couple of years, domestic telecom and broadcasters have been lobbying hard for a wider range of this lucrative and previously unused band. The government has called it a win-win situation as the distribution of this broadband is anticipated to expedite the launch of UHD TV transmission and the 5G or 5th generation telecom era. Korea is currently eyeing a lucrative railway project in Southeast Asia that will link Malaysia and Singapore. It's in the process of forming a consortium made up of public and private enterprises as it attempts to win the multi-billion-dollar project. Son Jung-in reports.
Construction of a high-speed rail line connecting Malaysia's capital Kuala Lumpur and Singapore is set to begin later this year. And Korea's major railroad manufacturer, Korea Rail Network Authority, has stepped up to form a public-private consortium in order to win the lucrative contract. Once completed in 2020, the envisioned rail line will allow passengers to ride the 330 kilometers between the two cities in just 90 minutes. However, competition to win the bid is intense. Countries like Japan, China, France, and Germany, who all boast world-class high-speed rail technology, are expected to submit their own bids.
In order to win the bid, Korea needs to form a consortium of government, public, and civil organizations to take on the strong field of contenders.
The railroad construction company held a briefing session with private enterprises earlier this month to share views on the feasibility analysis and to map out measures to fund the project.
Based on our experience constructing the Gyeongbu and Honam high-speed railways in Korea, if we strengthen cooperation between the private and public sector, I think there's a good chance we'll win the project.
The consortium plans to finalize the formation of its members by the end of August. If Korea wins the $12 billion project, it will create over 35,000 new jobs, raise the country's GDP by nearly 0.5%, and elevate Korea's global stature as an elite railway power. 손정인, Arirang News.
And those are stories we have for you on this Monday afternoon here in Seoul. For more of the latest, don't forget to check out our website arirang.com/news and do download our smartphone application. Just search for Arirang TV. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.